Good to see so many of you here tonight. I want to say a special thanks again to the members of the book club. They were normally meeting at 7 o'clock, and they switched to 6 tonight so that we wouldn't be in conflict. So I'm very grateful for that. We're going to start with prayer, and then I will explain to you what I hope we're going to do not only for the 4 weeks, but tonight, and we'll take it from there. All right? So I think all of you know this. I'm going to invite you to stand for this song, keeping in mind that the title of this series is the evidence of things not seen. Open my eyes, Lord, help me to see your face. Open my eyes, Lord, help me to see. Open my ears, Lord, help me to hear your voice. Open my ears, Lord, help me to hear. Open my heart, Lord, help me to love like you. Open my heart, Lord, help me to love. I live within you, deep in your heart, oh love. I live within you, rest now in me.
A reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Because of it, the ancients were well attested. By faith, we understand that the universe was ordered by the word of God, so that what is visible came into being through the invisible. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Let us pray. O holy God, we do long to see you. We long to see your works. We hope that you open our eyes, all our senses, that we may be in touch with your divine presence among us and respond with gratitude and fidelity. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So I'm going to give you a little background as to how I landed on this topic. As you know, most of you, for a while I was a full-time professor at the seminary, and my area of specialization was liturgy and sacramental theology. And right at the core of liturgy and sacramental theology is sign and symbol. So for years, I was reading and teaching about that. And so I was always on the lookout for sources and things that might just better inform me of what all that was all about. I began to get a little concerned that, we know that religious affiliation in our day and age is dropping off. And one of the convictions that I came to was that disaffiliation is at least partly a result of the fact that in our day and age, the symbols that used to connect for people don't do so in quite the same way. And so I have been exploring ways to understand how symbols work and perhaps how we might get a better handle on the reasons for those disaffiliations so that we might be able to draw people back into a more active participation in our Christian community. So part of what I'm going to share with you tonight and in the next 3 weeks after this is some of the reading that I've done, some of the ideas that I've come to, but I really am going to be looking for your wisdom in all of this, your feedback. I made an attempt to do something like this at something called the Cleveland Ecumenical Institute about 4 years ago. And one of the things that I discovered was that I have been so immersed in this stuff for so long that I didn't even realize the language that I was using, that it was abstract, that it was technical, and even though I thought I was speaking English, for some people, it didn't sound much like English. So hopefully what I have done in preparing this is, I'm not going to say dumb it down because there's nobody here who's dumb, but hopefully what I've been able to do is make it a little more specific, a little more concrete. It's doing some technical language is going to be unavoidable. I'm hoping that as a result of what we're doing, that we will all be better equipped to understand not only what our symbols are, but how they work. Okay? So the overview of the series is, tonight we're going to take an in-depth look at how symbols work. And we're not just talking about religious symbols here, but we're talking about all kinds of symbols. And the reason for that will become clear. Then next week, with this background, we'll look at official religious symbols. Those are the symbols that you might recognize when you come to church, when you celebrate the sacraments, when you engage in religious devotions. Then, after that, I want to wrestle with the question of what happens when those things that are supposed to be evidence of God's presence and activity in our life for too many people don't seem to be working anymore. What might be some of the reasons for that? And if we can identify some of those reasons, then perhaps we can make some adjustments that will make those things possible. Oops. And then the last session I'm calling Finding God Where God Finds Us. Because one of my core convictions is if people aren't finding God in what we call traditional religious symbols and affiliation, does that mean God's not with us? Does that mean God is not reaching out to people and touching people? And my answer to that is a resounding no. I think God finds a way. And so as we examine our symbolic universes, part of our task is going to be to find God where God finds us. So you can see that there is a kind of logic to the 4 sessions that we have here. They build on one another. A couple of people have said, what if I can't make one of the sessions? Well, Nicole has been kind enough to record them. You will be able to look at my part of the content if you can't make a session. Unfortunately, we won't record the conversations that happen at table, so that part will be missed, and that part I think is going to be particularly valuable. Okay? So does the overview of the series make sense? Okay? So let's take a look at the overview of what I hope to do tonight. First, we're going to take a short look at what it means to say that humans are symbolizing animals. So we're going to, for the first couple of sessions, we're going to be bringing religion and science, religion and symbolizing, science and symbolizing together. And then we're going to take a quick look at the neurological basis of symbolizing. And by the way, this presentation includes bits and pieces of what I've done in other places and some things that I haven't done in other places. So, this is a little bit of a hybrid. Then after we look at the neurological basis of symbolizing, then I'm going to give you an extended example of what symbolizing or symbolic engagement is all about. I think I found a really good example. I hope it will stimulate your own imagination. Then I'll invite you to think about your own experience of symbolic engagement or symbolic enactment. Then we're going to take, and this is where it might get a little bit technical, what is involved in symbolizing and symbolic engagement. There's going to be some technical terms there, but I think you can deal with them. Then small group conversation. Then I'm going to give you some homework. Okay? It's thinking homework. It's not, written or anything like that. Then we'll do a closing prayer. All right? Does that make sense? All right, humans as symbolizing animals. I'm just about finished reading this book. It's called The Symbolic Species, The Coevolution of Language and the Brain. It's written by a man named Terence W. Deacon, who is a world-renowned researcher in neuroscience and evolutionary anthropology. So he wrestles with the question in this book, which came first, the brain or language? What do you think? All right, he says that's what everybody thinks. Okay, but he offers a little more complicated explanation. He says the prevailing hypothesis was that the brains of what we now call human beings were not only bigger than other animals, but that the scientists thought there was a specific center in the brain that was a language center. And they thought that that language center developed as kind of a mutation that happened over the course of evolution. And once this language center was present in the brain, then bingo, human beings could use language, and part and parcel of what language is all about is symbolizing. Okay. There was a very famous linguist in the latter part of the 20th century, first part of this century, named Noam Chomsky. And he was a proponent of this theory of language. The bigger brain equipped for language came first, and then because of that specific language structure in the brain, every human being had what he calls a deep grammar. There was a deep grammar that underlie every language that human beings speak, and we know that human beings speak a lot of very different languages. But the premise was that's all because of the language center in the brain. Deacon's research says that's just probably not right. Okay, and his book was written in 1996. He's since been following that up with additional research. But he says the evidence seems to be that language and the brain co-evolved. And as human beings, and this is over a period of tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, and little by little, as our ancestors began to use things that we would look at as bits and pieces of language, bits and pieces of symbols, that what happened was the brain would, in the course of evolution, figure out a way to understand those languages and that symbol, and then the languages themselves would evolve. They would change, and as those things changed, then there would be additional opportunities for the brain to evolve, and the connections that would happen in the brain would become more and more complex. So his theory is that the brain and language co-evolved, and we are unique in this regard in all of the animal kingdom to have the ability to have the kind of language that we do and to do the kind of symbolizing that we do. Hence the language, the symbolizing species. So one of the reasons for this topic tonight is that it has to do with who we are. It has to do with how we are, not only with respect to God, but with respect to the reality in which we dwell in our relationships with one another. Back in 2009, Terence Deacon teamed up with another scholar and wrote an article called "The Role of Symbolic Capacity in the Origin of Religion." So he sees religion as evolving as a result of this. And he says what happened because of the way language and the human brain co-evolved is that over time, human beings were able to experience what he calls higher emotions, which emotions are in turn the source of what he calls the things we kind of associate with transcendent forms of experience or faith experience. So it says it's because we have the kinds of brains that we have that are able to use symbols that we can experience things like awe, reverence, a sense of the sacred, selfless action for others, a sense of unity with the cosmos, charity, humility, and loving kindness. I mean, when you think about the kinds of emotions we associate with religious experience, those are emotions that come to mind frequently. So that's their hypothesis. So not only are we symbolizing animals, but we symbolizing animals have the capacity for religious experience because of the very thing that makes us symbolizing animals. Making sense so far? Okay. Now, for the sake of full disclosure, Terence Deacon and the person who co-authored this article about the origins of religion do not themselves prescribe any religion. For them, this is just the higher form of human emotional expression. But for those of us who believe in the evidence of things not seen, we would say that this is the foundation for our symbolic encounter of the reality that we call God. Okay? So that's the first thing that we want to lay out on the line, the perhaps most fundamental reason for this conversation about symbols and religious experience. So now we're going to go to what I'm calling the neurological basis of symbolizing. That's the wrong book. This comes from a book that I read a couple years ago called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. It's written by a woman named Lisa Feldman Barrett, and she herself is a neuroscientist. And this is a much more recent expression of the findings of neuroscience. And Feldman says this. She says, we tend to experience the world as something that's a given, okay? We look around, we see, we hear, and we say, well, that's the world. She said, but actually neuroscience provides evidence that that's mistaken. The world we experience is largely our own construction, based upon our past experiences and social and cultural location. How does this happen? It doesn't mean that there isn't a world out there, but that what we identify as the world is really a product of our own construction. And here's the case that she makes. She talks about something that the brain receives input from both inside our bodies and from outside our bodies. The input that we receive from inside the body is called interoception. So if you look to the left-hand side of that slide. And she said interoception is your brain's representation of all the senses from your internal organs and tissues, the hormones in your blood, and your immune system. And she talks about intrinsic brain activity. 86 million neurons connected into massive networks, constantly firing, stimulating each other, sometimes millions at a time, continuous from birth until death, kind of like breathing. So interoception keeps the heart pumping, the lungs breathing, and other internal functions working smoothly. It's also the origins of dreams, daydreams, imagination, mind wandering, etc. And ultimately, she says, it's the origin of every sensation we experience. Interoception. But we also have sensory experience of things outside of us. Okay? We have visual experience, auditory experience, taste experience, touch experience, smell experience. And at the same time that all this interoception is going on, we're being bombarded by millions of stimuli from outside our body. And here's the important thing, she says. The brain does not see colors and does not see shapes that are out there. The brain does not hear words and music that are out there. The brain doesn't taste sweet and sour that are out there. But it sorts and organizes all these external experiences that we then give the name to: sweet, sour, red, blue, green, etc. So you can see here we have internal sensory experience, and then sensory experience that comes from the outside. And then she makes a critical move. She said, the brain, trapped within the skull, predicts what these inputs are by comparing them to previous experience. So the brain is a predictor of what it is that we are interpreting. And our predictions have to be tested. So a prediction is, what is this sensory input that's coming to me? How will I name it? How will I identify it? How will I respond to it? And I do that by hypothesizing. I make a guess. What will happen next? And she uses the analogy that the brain is like a scientist. As this input comes in, the brain says, is this something that I've experienced before, or is it something different? If the brain recognizes something that we've had in our prior experience, it's like the responsible scientist who takes the data into account. And the other thing here is that first prediction that we're talking about now of what is this taste, smell, etc., that happens prior to our conscious experience. Even before we're able to name it, our brain is processing that stuff and moving us to make a prediction. The brain can also be like a biased scientist. When the input doesn't match our prior experience, then we try to manipulate the data in order to come to the conclusion that we want to come to. Often, and sometimes the brain operates as an unscrupulous scientist. It just disregards the evidence of the senses in order to say, I'd prefer to believe what I believe is out there. Or it can be a curious scientist. Let me learn more. So what's the value of prediction? So suppose you're walking along a path in a heavily wooded area, and you know there's wildlife in that heavily wooded area, and you hear a rustling in the bushes. You're getting some sense experience coming into you. So your brain, even before you're conscious of it, your brain is making a prediction. This is the wind, right? And you name it the wind. Your brain might also say, well, wait a minute, that's a predator. And so I'm going to make a prediction that that's a predator. It would be relatively important to know the difference between whether that's a predator or whether it's the wind, right? So there's consequences to being able to predict accurately and then to test those predictions. Okay? And Barrett goes on to say that the aim of all of this stuff that's going on, interoception, external perception, and prediction, is to keep the body functioning, keep fuel and maintain the body budget and body functions, and keep the interoception working. That's the stuff that keeps you alive. So now here are some conclusions. Some conclusions that will pertain to our consideration of the topic. Our experience of the world, including our religious experience, is not a simple given, but rather something of our own construction. Okay, you can see, it's all our experience happens that way. This experience is thoroughly embodied. It originates in the body and interacts with the world in an embodied way. The experience is inextricably linked to previous experience, to personal and collective history. It's socially and culturally embedded, and the unexpected, like that rustling in the woods, may capture our attention more readily than the expected. And the experience is based upon predictions which can be right or wrong. And you can see, looking ahead, how some of these same things would be applicable to trying to get a handle on our religious experience. But right now, we're just talking about normal human symbolic experience. I was supposed to be showing you those, sorry. All right, so now I'm going to give you an example of a symbolic engagement or a symbolic experience that is my own. Any of you ever been to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington?
Yeah.
Okay. As you probably know, this was the brainchild, this particular version of Maya Ying Lin, who was a Yale University student and daughter of Chinese immigrants. It was designed and constructed in 1982. Okay. as far as I can remember, there's more than 55,000, maybe 58,000 names on this monument. So I want to tell you my symbolic experience of this memorial. It happened first of all, when I was going to school in D.C., I got to the Vietnam Memorial frequently. But this is maybe my first and second experience telescoped together. It was a fall evening, after dark. Oh, and by the way, as you're looking at this picture, you can see in the background, you can see the Washington Monument. Can you see that from where you are? So this is a picture looking to the east. The north would be to the left. Behind us is at least back in 1984, was the Lincoln Memorial. Okay? And as you look at this other view, you can see how the monument is shiny and people can see reflections in it. Okay. So anyway, in this fall evening of 1984, after dark, I was walking into the monument. As you know, you can see it starts out shallow and then it gets deeper and deeper until you get to the middle, and then it begins to shallow up again. And I'm walking through into this monument, and right in front of me, walking into this monument, is Ernest Borgnine. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm here at the Vietnam Memorial with McHale from McHale's Navy. And I remember feeling that I was being drawn into this monument, being drawn deeper and deeper into this monument in a way that was reflective of the way that our country was drawn into the Vietnam War. Okay? There was a kind of visceral experience that went along with that. Part of what drew me into that monument, in addition to its own aesthetic beauty, were the names. And I knew that there were at least two names on that monument that I had familiarity with. Mary Ann, you'll remember both of these probably. One was John Duchnowski. John Duchnowski was a member of my home parish, and when I was in about 5th grade, John was a Marine in Vietnam. And when I was in about 5th grade, I was standing in line with my other classmates getting ready to go home for lunch. And the pastor came into the group of students and whisked a couple of girls out of those lines. Turns out he was whisking John Duchnowski's sisters out of the lines because John had been killed in Vietnam. And it happened that my family, which is in the funeral business, was handling the funeral for John. It also happened that in the course of handling that funeral, the Marines sent an escort to be with the body and to make sure that all the proper protocol was followed. This Marine's name was Mark Anthony Vasquez, and he stayed with our family for about a week while all of this was going on. And as about a 10 or 11-year-old, I was just enwrapped by this guy's stories, telling us what the Marines were like and what the war experience was like, and I really wanted to be like Mark Anthony Vasquez. And after the funeral, when Mark went back west, we wrote letters back and forth. And also after he left, I convinced a group of kids in my class to start the Junior Marines. We'd had no idea what we were doing, but we would meet at the park and we would exercise and pretend like we were going on, sorties and things like that. So I wrote to Mark back and forth for quite a while, and after a while, I didn't get any more letters from Mark. And you can guess what happened. I got a letter from his mother saying, Mark has been killed in Vietnam. So I knew that when I went to this Vietnam memorial, there were going to be at least two names that I wanted to find. And I did find them both. Also, I remembered that while the Vietnam War was going on, there was daily reporting of what was going on in the war. Probably most people here are old enough to remember that. Yes. But there was also conscription. There was a draft from 1964 to 1973. I turned 18 in 1972. So I was old enough to be drafted, and that weighed heavily on me. And you may remember how this worked. There would be numbers drawn based, at random. There would be ages, and then they would, beginning with the highest numbers, they would conscript the people who were, when needed, from the lowest numbers. The last year that they drew the numbers, but right after they stopped calling people, I was number 9. And I didn't go into the seminary to avoid the draft. But that was part of my experience of the Vietnam War. So now I'm at the Vietnam Memorial. It's 1984, and I'm being drawn into this monument, and I get to the vertex. Let's see if I can back up here. I get to this place right over here, right where the V comes in. And I'm standing there, and I'm looking at the names on the monument. It wasn't the names of Mark and John. They were someplace else. But I was noticing the names. And then I noticed that when I stood at one side of the vertex, I could see, through the names, I could see the Lincoln Memorial. And when I stood at the other side of the vertex, I could see the Washington Monument. That was striking to me. And then, as I looked at each of those and saw the names, the monuments, then I saw myself. And that was revelatory. It was surprising to me. It was eye-opening that I was in the middle of all of this. There is a movie right now out. It's not about this, but it has a great title. It's called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And that's kind of what that experience was for me. Everything, everywhere, all at once. So that's the symbolic experience that I am sharing with you. You can see it's not a simple experience. You can see that there's a lot involved in it. And so I am going to invite you now, in silence, see if you can summon for yourself, even before you start talking, I'll tell you when you can talk, see if you can identify for yourself a symbolic experience or symbolic encounter that was important to you. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just silently think about that. And it doesn't have to be religious. Okay, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. And now, again, before you speak, see if you can identify in what ways was your experience similar to or maybe different than the example that I gave. Just give a minute or two of silent reflection to that. And now I'm going to ask you to share your answers to those two, the first and the third questions there. Remember that we're going to respect other people's sharing and experience, that we're not going to pass any judgment, but we're going to listen, eager to learn. Okay, so feel free to turn around and engage the conversation. Thank you for your cooperation in that exercise. It sounded like there was good conversation. One of the things I want to point out is symbols are not just something that we see. It can be any kind of sensory experience or extended experience that might engage multiple senses. So that's that'll show itself as we go on. So now we're going to take a more in-depth look, and this is what gets a little bit more technical about what is involved in symbolizing, or what this man here calls symbolic engagement. Remember when I was talking about interoception and perception outside the body? What the net result of those predictions is that we construct signs that mediate our world to us. Okay? It is through those signs that we encounter and experience the world as we predict. Okay? So this brings me to Robert Cummings Neville. Robert Cummings Neville he describes himself as a Confucian Methodist. He is a philosopher. He's still alive as far as I know. He would be in his early 80s on the East Coast. His background is in American pragmatic philosophy. which is significant by contrast to continental European philosophy, okay? Because on both the European continent and in North America, there were philosophers who were wrestling with signs and how do signs work. And they're very different, and I think that what happened here on this side of the ocean makes a whole lot more sense, which is why I'm going to share with you Neville. Neville was, one of his main conversation partners was a philosopher named Charles Saunders Peirce. Peirce was a scientist himself. He lived from, if I get the dates right, from 1839 to 1914, and he constructed a very elaborate system of understanding signs that we would call semiotics. He's not the only one who does semiotics, but he has a system of signs called semiotics. In addition to being a pragmatic philosopher, he's big into metaphysics. We're not going to dwell on this tonight because it's going to come up later when we're looking more explicitly at religious symbolism. It is he who uses the language of symbolic engagement. And he says symbolic engagement, just like Barrett says, it's an act of interpretation. I think he would also say it is a form of prediction. This is what I like about, among the many things I like about Neville. He is a proponent of something he calls fallibilism. He says when we make predictions about what our symbols mean and whether they're true or false, we could be wrong. And as long as we are committed collectively to the pursuit of the truth of the symbols, then in the long run, we will become more and more confident in and convinced of the truth of those symbols. But we have to acknowledge that we can be wrong. I like that a lot.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, that...
You're wrong.
how we
Specifically, I mean, you could be wrong.
Sure. I mean, let's go back to the walking along the path. Okay.
Right.
That's a noise. Well, wait a minute. It really was a lion. You know. And if, let's say there are 3 or 4 of us walking down that path, and we all hear the noise, and 2 out of the 3 say it's a lion, and 1 says it's the wind. Yeah. Okay. So that would be that's a simplified example, but does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And so he believes that all our assertions about what symbols mean are hypotheses that need to be tested over and over and over again. Okay? And he would say the same thing about assertions that we make theologically as we go forward, but we're not going to get into all that tonight. He talks about the truth of symbols. I'm going to get back into that in a little bit. And he believes that one of the ways of getting at the truth of symbols, and religious symbols in particular, is to engage the widest possible public conversation partners. So it isn't just lay people talking to bishops. It isn't just Christians talking to Christians. It is about Christians talking to people of other religions, talking to scientists, talking to artists, and talking to people in other disciplines. And if everybody is committed to identifying fallibly the truth of the symbols, then collectively we run the greatest chance of landing on the truth of what those symbols are all about. Just today, I registered a young man in the parish. I saw him for the first time last weekend, and he's kind of an amazing guy, 39 years old. I'm not going to say, I don't want to just out him, but he came in saying he has a degree in theology, and his passion is to, among others, is to look at the relationship between religion and theology. And certainly Neville and his approach would buy into that kind of dialogue between religion and theology. That would be an example of a wide conversation partner. Okay? So Neville, so I first learned about Neville when back in 1997, I think it was, as I was still teaching full-time, and I was always on the lookout for a resource. I was in a used bookstore, or a bookstore for used books, how's that? And found this book called The Truth of Broken Symbols. Neville wrote this. It has to deal with religious symbols, but not just Christian symbols, across the board. And it was in this book that I first became aware of what his system was. Since then, I've read, with no exaggeration, 12 or 15 things by Neville. Okay. More recently, he wrote this book called On the Scope and Truth of Theology, Theology as Symbolic Engagement. That's how you see that phrase, symbolic engagement. Okay. So, when Neville talks about interpreting signs and symbols, interpretation is the act of taking a sign to stand for an object in a certain respect. Okay, that's important. An act of taking the person who is taking the sign to stand for an object in a certain respect is what Charles Peirce called an interpretant. Okay? Now, a respect is the way in which the sign is said to stand for the object. Okay, so what would be an example of that? God is my rock. Okay? I'm taking an object to be a sign for God, right? But in what respect do I mean God is my rock? Is God is a weapon that I use against my enemies? Or God is the foundation upon which I base my life? You can see how, depending on the respect that you choose to take a symbol for standing for something, that you can be either accurate or you can be off the mark. And Neville would say that there's a lot of harm that is done, and certainly a lot of error that happens when the respect in which a sign stands for an object is mistaken. Okay? So getting the appropriate respect for, and by respect I don't mean self-esteem or something like that, I mean in what sense does this sign stand for this object? And Neville identifies reference. A sign stands for an object. Okay? The object is the referent. But, of course, reference isn't just one thing. He says there are, and actually his system is much more complicated than this. I'm using the watered-down version that Neville does. He says reference can be iconic. Okay? So iconic reference is when the symbol kind of looks like the reality that it's standing for in that respect. I was thinking about the Vietnam memorial, and for me, the respect that I was taking that object, that sign, was as a way for me to understand my place in United States history, my place as a citizen, my place in the unfolding of this history. That was the respect. The sign, the Vietnam memorial itself, was iconic. You may remember I mentioned that I felt as I walked into that symbol that I was being drawn into that symbol the same way our country was being drawn into the war. So in that sense, there was an iconic reference that took place there. Does that make sense? Okay. He also says that there's an indexical form of reference. And I hope you can see that there's somebody standing there pointing. Okay. We have index fingers, right? An indexical reference is something that captures the attention of the person who's engaging in the act of interpretation. It's something that actually changes the person who is doing the act of interpretation by getting their attention, and does something inside of that person to get them to look at that and or to hear that or whatever it is a little bit differently. It connects them. Neville would say there's a kind of causal dimension to indexical reference. And then he says there's conventional reference. This is, I probably could have found a better way to graph this. Conventional reference is the realization that when we have a sign, the sign can mean many things. So let's say that the sign is a dog, okay? But let's imagine the kinds of words that can be used to refer to dog. It could be a mutt, it could be a purebred, it could be a pet, it could be a predator, It could be, well, you pick it, okay? And that's what conventional reference means. It means that there is the sign in the middle of all these different kinds of references, and whichever reference you choose is there for the taking. That's going to help to hone in the interpretation and the truth of that interpretation. So there's three kinds of reference. There's iconic, there's indexical, and there's conventional. And all three of those, most symbols have dimensions of all three of those. To go back to the Vietnam Memorial, for me, the indexical reference was the names of the people that I knew on the monument. Okay, they were pointing me to look at that monument. And frankly, it was also the reaction of others to the monument. I saw these people in the monument ahead of me looking, and that got my attention and got me wanting to be drawn into that. And the conventional references, think of the ways in which this monument could connect to other a whole system of meanings. The other monuments and their significance, Lincoln Memorial, Washington Monument. If you're familiar with the mall, you know that on the other side of the Lincoln Memorial, there's Arlington National Cemetery. On the other side of the Washington Monument, there's the Capitol. On the other side of that, there's the Supreme Court. And all of those are part and parcel of the conventional meanings that might be engaged. The starkness and the darkness of the war would be part of the conventional reference. The violence and death. Guerrilla warfare, which was so prominent in the Vietnam War, also part of all of this. I mentioned before, conscription. How many times did we hear during the Vietnam War the justification that we're trying to prevent a domino effect of communism overrunning the world? The experience of other wars, the just war theory. All these are possible conventional references that are all kind of interlinked with one another. So all this has to do with what Neville calls extensional meaning. There are networks of symbols. Okay, so there's the Vietnam War, and then there's these networks of symbols around the Vietnam War. But suppose we took, out of that network, suppose we took guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare itself has a network of symbols around it. Okay, so we put Vietnam Memorial, guerrilla warfare, one on top of the other. And suppose that we took the domino effect, and that itself has a network of symbols around it. And suppose we took that and put Vietnam Memorial, domino effect, and guerrilla warfare. And so what begins to happen is that those networks stack one on top of the other. And the references get more and more and more complicated. Okay? Is this making sense? Okay? So the networks themselves are neither true nor false. They are possible alternatives to what we are going to predict in our interpretation. And I just described what it means that those extensional networks, those extensional meanings are layered. The intentional meaning is taking from all of those networked, layered meanings and saying, this is the meaning or the meanings that I'm going to associate with this object in this respect. Okay, so you can just see how it's not surprising that the same person can look at and engage the same symbol and come up with alternative interpretations. It's why we need a wide group of conversation partners to make hypotheses and to test those hypotheses. Okay? And the intentional meanings engage several layers at once. I hope that's clear by now. But then there's other factors that affect the interpretation. So we're engaging a symbol which takes an object, which takes a sign to stand for an object in a certain respect, and we've got them referring iconically, indexically, and conventionally, and now they're in layers, and now we're ready to do interpretation and prediction according to the way Barrett says. But then there are other factors that say which of these symbols and which of these meanings are we going to land on. One determination is context. I think context is a really important determinant. I was trying to think about this with respect to the Vietnam War Memorial. Probably I would have experienced that differently if it was on a Veterans Day, okay, where there was something going on nationally. Or probably I would have experienced that differently if our country had been drawn into another war at that particular point in time. Or if I had just been to the funeral of somebody who was killed in the war. Or this wasn't an important determinant of the context. When I was there were Vietnam War vets who had little stands, tents around the monument, trying to get support for veterans of the Vietnam Memorial. So the context within which all this happens can shape the interpretation that gets landed on. Purposes. For what reason is this interpretation being engaged? What is my reason for acknowledging and engaging this? When I was at the monument, the purpose was curiosity, frankly. I'd heard about this, I'd seen it, and frankly, I think that probably was helpful in that context because it left me open to a number of possibilities, all of which came rushing in, everything, everywhere, all at once. Dispositions. How open is the person? What kind of sensitivities does a person have as he or she engages the symbol that is in play? And then Neville talks about developmental levels. Certainly, a child is going to engage this symbol differently than a teenager, than is an adult, and then is a senior citizen. Certainly, someone who has his or her right emotional state of mind is going to engage this symbol differently than someone who might be a little off kilter. All those things come into play in engaging these extensional meanings through an act of intending. Okay, is this clear so far? Does that make sense? Okay. The last big concept that we need to talk about is, what is the truth of a symbol? If you look at what is on the left-hand side of the page, you can see that there's a guy sitting there, and at his feet there is a cat, and in his head there is a picture of that cat. Okay? This is a classic Thomistic Aristotelian notion of truth, which is that the form of the object, which is the cat, gets transferred into the mind of the person who is perceiving. And when the image in the mind corresponds to the form of the cat, then St. Thomas and Aristotle would say that's what truth is. That's known often as the correspondence theory of truth. Coming from his pragmatic understanding of truth, Neville says, no, that's not what I mean by truth. He says, truth is the carryover of value from that which is in the object into the interpreter in the respect to which the sign is being taken to stand for the object. So let's go back to the walking through the park and hearing the rustling and having to determine. Neville would say, the truth is that we identify what's most important in the respect that we're interpreting the sign. So the value in interpreting that sign is getting it right so I don't get eaten, right? Okay, so the carryover of value would be that, okay? Or conversely, it could be, there's no need to be afraid because this is just wind. What's important to know about this is that it is rustling in the wind. So there's a different sense of what truth is in all of this. So if I go back to my Vietnam Memorial experience and I ask myself, what is the truth of that symbolic experience for me? I'm going to say, at that moment, it was for me an accurate identification of what Neville and other places call existential location. This is where I am and who I am in this place and time in a way that accurately reflects what is most important in my standing here in this moment. Okay, that's the truth of that symbol. Notice we're not talking about correspondence because there was so much that was involved in that experience of the symbol. But all of that comes together to hold up and bring together that which was most important in that particular moment. Okay? Make sense? Okay. So now I'm going to go back to what Barrett said early on, and I shared this with you. So our experience of the world is not a simple given, but rather something of our own construction. Does this make more sense now? Okay. This experience is thoroughly embodied. I was standing in the middle of this. I experienced this with my eyes and with my senses. It's inextricably linked to previous experience. You heard me say all those things that brought me to that interpretation of the Vietnam Memorial, that everything, everywhere, all at once. Certainly socially and culturally embedded. Okay? The fact that I was an American citizen, that I was embedded in a culture when this war was going on, that I was at risk of being conscripted, where there was anti-war movements, where Muhammad Ali was a conscientious objector, and all of those things played into my experience of that symbol. The intrigue of the unexpected. Remember I mentioned that often the unexpected captures our attention more than the expected? I didn't expect to see myself in that monument in the same way that I did that evening. That was important. And I think some of that's going to be important as we play with, in the best sense of the term, how religious symbols touch us. And this experience is based upon predictions which can be wrong or right, depending on the conclusions that I draw about what is my existential location here and what are the implications. I might make some judgments that are right or some that are off the mark. Okay? They might be fallible. I might need to talk to other people who are standing there doing the same thing and say, what's your experience here? And how can we help each other to understand our experience, maybe reinforce it, or maybe even offer some correctives. Okay? All right, small group conversation. Let's see how much time we have. We have a little bit of time. I'd like you to return to the example you first surfaced in the small group conversation. And then, this is going to be challenging because I just threw a ton of stuff at you. But as you look at those experiences, with what respect did you make the connection to this symbol? What would be some examples of the reference? Iconic, indexical, conventional? What were some of the extensional meanings that were at play? And which of those extensional meanings did you make intentional? And how did these other things factor in context, purposes, dispositions, and developmental levels? And then what was the truth? I don't expect you to get to all of that in 10 minutes, but just see if you can touch base with maybe one or two of those elements to help you understand a little bit more how that symbolic encounter you had, how that symbolic engagement worked. Okay? I'm going to leave this slide up there so you can keep an eye on what the factors were. So give it a crack. Next week we're going to be considering official religious symbols. So I'm going to ask you in the course of the next week to think about an official religious symbol or symbolic engagement that was for you an encounter with God, with the divine, with the holy, with profound meaning. Okay? I think some of you heard me tell a story about Myra Yurkic. Several years ago, before she died, she was participating in the rite of foot washing on Holy Thursday, and 6 weeks afterwards, she came to my office and said, I want you to tell me what happened there, because something happened in me and I can't explain it. You know, it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that, but see if you can identify an experience of an official, maybe it's Mass, maybe it's a funeral, maybe it's some other sacrament, maybe it's some devotion, but something that would be recognized as part of the Catholic Christian umbrella of symbols. Okay? And I suppose it doesn't even have to be Catholic or Christian. If it's another one, you can identify that as well. And then try to identify the forms of reference, the extensional and intentional meanings, the respect, and the truth of the symbol. I'm going to start next week by a quick review of these things so that I'm not going to pretend that you're going to remember all of this. But please know that, Nicole, where are they going to find this online?
It'll be on the YouTube channel.
Okay, it'll be on the YouTube channel. So if you want to review some of this content, it'll be the evidence of things not seen on the YouTube. Okay. Now it'll get everything but the small group conversations. Okay. I really want to thank you for being here tonight. I felt like a positive energy here. This was symbolic to me of the life and the interest in this community that makes this community so vibrant. Okay, so I would like to invite you all to please stand. And we will conclude by singing together this familiar song. We walk by faith and not by sight. No gracious words we hear of him who spoke as none e'er spoke, but we believe him near. We may not touch his hands and side, nor follow where he trod, yet in his promise we rejoice and cry, my Lord and God. Help then, O Lord, our unbelief, and may our faith abound to call on you when you are near, and seek where you are found. That when our life of faith is done, in realms of clearer light, we may behold you as you are, in full and endless sight. Amen. Amen. And you're done 3 minutes early. Okay.
Amen.
Travel safely, everybody.